All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to tear into a really important paper for your qualifying exams, so you'll definitely want to take notes. We're breaking down Ahern and Dittmar's 2012 classic, The Changing of the Boards.
So, let's just start with this question. What actually happens? This isn't just some theoretical question. It's exactly what went down in Norway in the early 2000s. And what that did was give researchers this perfect natural experiment to see what happens to a company's value when you mess with its board. This setup is really what makes the paper so powerful. So, let's dive in.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll get the lowdown on the law itself. Then we're going to get into the really clever research design. Honestly, this is the secret sauce that makes the paper famous. After that, we'll see what the numbers say about firm value, dig into why things happen the way they did, and then we'll boil it all down to the one thing you absolutely need to remember.
Okay, first things first. The whole study, everything we're about to talk about, it all hinges on this one single, really powerful event that happened in Norway.
I mean, just think about the sheer scale of this change. You're going from 9% women on boards to a legally mandated 40%. That's a huge leap. And this wasn't some friendly suggestion from the government. It was a hard rule with a strict deadline. If you didn't comply, your company could actually be dissolved.
And wow, this chart just says it all, doesn't it? You can see that solid line for women on boards just skyrocketing between 2003 and 2008. But here's what's really interesting. Look at the other lines. Female CEOs, female chairs, they barely budged. So what this tells you is that this wasn't some broad organic shift. It was a surgical strike aimed directly at board seats. So, this law sets up this fantastic debate, a real intellectual horse race between two big ideas. On one hand, you've got the glass ceiling view. If firms were unfairly ignoring talented women, then forcing them to hire women should actually increase a company's value, right? But on the other hand, you have the optimal choice view. This says that firms were already picking the very best people they could find. If that's true, then this law is just a constraint that's going to force them to make worse choices and decrease value. The data from Norway lets us see which idea wins out.
So how can you possibly measure the real impact of this law? I mean, so many other things could be affecting these companies, right? Well, that brings us to the identification strategy. And for your exams, pay close attention, because this is the part that really impresses people. This right here is the classic chicken and egg problem in corporate finance. It's almost impossible to untangle. And the reason this Ahern and Dittmar paper is so famous is because this situation in Norway gave them a brilliant, almost accidental way to solve it.
So here's the logic, and it's so clever. Step 1. The law was a shock from the outside. Firms didn't ask for it. Step 2, and this is the key. The shock wasn't the same for everyone. A company with 0 women on its board had a huge mountain to climb, way bigger than a company that was already at, say, 20%. And that variation, that's the magic. It allowed the researchers to use a firm's starting percentage of women as a clean instrument to isolate the true causal effect of being forced to change the board.
Okay, so now we understand the method. Let's get to the juicy part. The results. What did the market actually think of this new law?
And you're not going to believe this. The announcement of the law was a complete and total surprise. The minister behind it later said he had to use terrorist tactics, literally leaking the plan to a journalist before his own government even knew. Why does that matter? It means the market's reaction was to brand new, totally unexpected information. That's a goldmine for researchers.
And the market's reaction? It was swift and clear. For those firms that were starting from 0, the ones with no female directors at all, their stock prices dropped by 3.5% pretty much overnight. That was the market's instant verdict.
But, and this is so important, what about the firms that were already part of the way there? For them, nothing. The announcement had almost no effect. This shows that the market wasn't just punishing everyone. The penalty was directly proportional to how big of a change the law was forcing on the company. The bigger the constraint, the bigger the hit.
Okay, so that was the immediate stock reaction. But the researchers also wanted to know about the long-term effects. For that, they used a measure called Tobin's Q. All you really need to know is it compares what a company's worth in the market to what its physical assets are worth.
And what they found in the long run basically confirmed the market's initial gut reaction. Using their clever research design, they found that for every 10% of the board that was forced to change to include women, the firm's long-term value dropped by over 12%. So this wasn't just a temporary blip, it was a significant and lasting drop in value.
All right, so the what is pretty clear. Value went down. Now we get to the million-dollar question, and the one your examiners will for sure ask, why? What was the actual mechanism here? Let's dig in.
This table tells a huge part of the story. When you look at who these new directors were, the difference is stark. The new women joining boards were, on average, a lot younger. But look at that top line, CEO experience. Less than a third of the new female directors had been a CEO, compared to nearly 70% of the men who were already on the boards. The law basically forced firms to go out and hire, but the pool of women with that top-tier executive experience was just too small at the time, so they ended up with younger, less seasoned directors.
And this change wasn't just on paper. It had real consequences. The firms that were hit hardest by the quota, the ones with these new, younger boards, started acting differently. They started taking on more debt, they made more acquisitions, and they kept less cash on hand. In short, they started taking on more risk, probably because the collective experience and risk tolerance in the boardroom had fundamentally changed.
Okay, let's bring it all home. If you're cramming for an exam and you can only remember one thing from this whole breakdown, make it this next part. This is it. This is the whole story in a nutshell. The negative effect they found was not, I repeat, not about gender. It was about experience. The problem wasn't that the new directors were women. The problem was that firms were forced, in a very short amount of time, to hire from a much smaller pool of candidates with traditional CEO-level experience.
Think about it in Econ 101 terms. The law created this massive, sudden demand shock for female directors. But the supply of women who had the same resume as the men they were replacing was inelastic. It couldn't just magically expand overnight. So firms were forced to hire less experienced directors, and the market reacted negatively to that loss of human capital.
And that leaves us with this final, really critical question. This study gives us an incredibly clear picture of the short-term costs. But what about the long-term? Is it possible that a shock like this actually helps create a bigger pipeline of experienced women over time? Could the long-term gains eventually outweigh these short-term costs? The paper doesn't answer that, but it's the crucial question it leaves us with. And that's where the research goes next.